Hey YouTube, today I'm going to talk about the Canon R6 settings. As I've been using it for way over a year now, I found the optimal settings that I like to use and I want to share it with you. I've been asked in the comments before what my settings are, so here we go. Let's jump right into the menu, starting on the first page here. Image quality. I like to shoot a RAW image as well as a JPEG. And the reason for that is RAW, you need it for Lightroom to get the highest quality image and have the maximum amount of wiggle room to modify it. But I also like to shoot a JPEG with it automatically, because what I found is I was exporting this manually anyway to kind of have a record of the day of what I shot in case I missed something. And I also like to go back a year or two from time to time and review what I did on that day, try to find a different shot. And then you have to open Lightroom, and then you have to update the Lightroom catalog to the latest version and then export it. So I found it's just easier to just create JPEGs. You have a record of the day. It's a really nice habit to get into, to create just a catalog of work for reference. And it doesn't take up a whole lot of space having JPEGs like that. I don't mess with cropping. I like to crop in post, not in the camera, or I don't need to visualize it. ISO speed settings, you want to just open that right up, have the maximum and minimum available to you at all times. Auto lighting, in most cases for the Canon R6 and digital cameras, I like to just go middle of the road, not heavy-handed and not underhanded. Choose the medium setting, let it do a little bit of work, but too much I find is just overboard and it looks modified. So this lets it modify the JPEG image that I'm exporting to look a little bit better than RAW, since I'm not going to really use that as a final anyway. It's just a reference image. So let it increase it and enhance it. Highlight tone priority I keep off. I really don't want anything I do to be modifying the highlights. I'm usually shooting for the shadow and the highlight, because it's so beautiful to get a high contrast, and this D+ and D2 is going to start washing in those whites to create a flat image, and it's just really boring to look at. You want that contrast. Let nature do its thing. White balance is one that I changed my mind on recently. I used to shoot in white priority, but what happened is I found I kept warming images up in post-production because things were looking so cool and cold. That's because, well, the sun has a warmer tone, and usually indoor lighting has a warmer tone, so it keeps modifying the color balance to go colder to compensate, and that would bring it back up. So I decided just let it do its thing, let it take the outside surroundings, keep it warm. Canon's already good at that, and then I can bring it cooler if I need to, but almost always it's more preferable to have a warm, pleasing image than a cold one. So I would only switch to the white priority if you were shooting commercial products and you needed higher color accuracy for some reason. Speaking of color accuracy, I've started shooting sRGB now, and the reason is 90% of what I do is web-based, uploading to Instagram, web pages, submissions, even some printers want sRGB. And yes, Adobe RGB is a better format for a wider range of colors, but if you forget to export your final image and convert it to sRGB, all your colors are going to go wacky. And I found from time to time I was forgetting. So now everything I do is just sRGB. It's a more error-free workflow. It's a smoother workflow. I don't have to think or remember to convert images. Everything is the way it needs to be for everything that I do. But definitely if you do more printing and you want more color range and more ability to modify your color, keep it Adobe RGB, but you're going to have to baby every single export to switch it over if you start uploading to the web. Picture style is more, again, picture style and custom white balance. I don't mess with these automatic settings. The camera is an incredible piece of technology in figuring out what settings it should use for a certain scenario. So most of the time, you want to let it do its thing. You don't want to be artificially adding clarity or artificially changing the color and forcing it down a path. It is pretty smart at what it does. Down that path, lens aberration, if your lens has barrel distortion or all kinds of weird vignetting, the RF series is so good at correcting it. You want to let this camera identify the lens it's using and fix that automatically for you. So keep all lens correction abilities on. I don't do a lot of long exposure, but if I am shooting high ISO, again, middle of the road, stick to standard, not heavy-handed, not too light. I don't do a lot of HDR or multiple exposure or interval, but you do want your shutter to be mechanical. It will reduce as many problems as possible. If you go electronic and you start shooting indoors, certain lights have a different frequency and refresh rate that Your camera could actually have this crazy weird light band in the middle of it. I like to keep image stabilization on like 99% of the time unless I'm on a tripod. I turn touch shutter disabled because sometimes my nose would hit the screen and take a shot, and I really didn't like that. Image review I still find important. Sometimes I like to hold my camera away from me, not use the viewfinder, and just use the LCD. And it's cool to be able to see the picture you took if you're shooting slower, to get a quick look at what you just did if something was moving fast past you and you want to see, oh, did I get it? Keep that review on, because then you're going to be chimping and hitting, okay, show me that preview, go find that image. Just let it show you right off the bat. Metering about 8 seconds I find is good enough. Once you kind of meter a target, you've taken the shot by then usually. Nothing much here to talk about. Switching over to the AF tab in our first area here, I almost always shoot Servo AF with face detect and eye detect on and people. I'm shooting people most of the time. It will even work for animals, but it's pretty smart also at just figuring out that, oh, you're taking a picture of some buildings, let me just find the best thing for you to focus on, and the camera does a fantastic job. Sometimes I'll turn eye detect off if I'm not getting a really good lock on, and I'll turn servo to single shot if my subject is just sitting there not moving. If I do happen to shoot manual, I leave the peaking on high color red just so I can quickly see, do I have something in focus? This one is really important. I'm still playing around with it, but I've learned a lot about these modes. And right now, I stick to case 2 because often I'm taking a picture of one person and I want it to stick with them no matter what. So if somebody walks by or they hold something in front of their face, it's going to try as hard as possible to keep them in focus and not what passes in front of the model. I found case 1 was doing a good job, but recently I had somebody blowing bubbles and it just kept locking into the bubbles, and case 2 was doing a better job at ignoring them and focusing on the face. Case 3 I found was just even worse in every scenario. If you're trying to take a picture of a bride and there's 3 people around her, the first person to move in any direction closer to your camera, it's going to lock onto them and you're going to lose the bride if you're on a shallow depth of field. So I would rarely use this in most scenarios for myself. Maybe if you were doing birding or something, you want to catch something really quickly, that would be great. And then this would be more for sports again. It is good at locking on, but as soon as a hockey player moves behind another player and peeks out of the other side, it's going to just switch focus to the foreground player and not the background player. Again, losing the subject that you were tracking with. So in most cases, case 2 is really, really good. And it's going to keep you locked on to what you're focused on most of the time. Moving over to the playback tab, I think the only important ones here is your very last tab. I don't like highlight alert showing me, what's white flashing in my face, or AF points that I use to take my shot, or grids. Once I've locked in my settings and I know I've got what I want to shoot, I don't want any of these distractions in the way. So I turn as much as I can off to enjoy the scene of what I'm actually looking at. Next we got Wi-Fi, not much to talk about there. Here we've got some more settings we can talk about in the gear. I like auto rotate so that if you do a lot of portrait shots and you put your camera vertical, you want to be able to preview it in your camera properly, but when you get to your screen, your big 30-inch monitor, you want it to rotate it so that you're seeing everything how you shot it. So if you shot a portrait with your camera in portrait mode, it will flip it portrait for you and rotate it properly. I've played around with this a bit and I feel like I've got a pretty good accurate color representation of what I shoot and what I'm going to see on screens. So I like the screen brightness of 4, viewfinder brightness of 4, color mode 2. I find that's the most accurate for highlights, contrast, and color. Moving over to our last settings here. In the first tab, you want these to go in thirds so that you get the maximum amount of ability out of your settings. I personally have the shutter speed range locked to not go lower than 15. If I'm in AV mode, I don't want it going all of a sudden to a 1 second shutter speed and everything's blurry. Even 15 might be blurry, but I found sometimes I'm just stationary and I'm okay with holding it like that with all the stabilization involved. It can still nail a shot. The R6 is pretty good. I have some custom buttons here set. Looking at the camera column here, I have my star button here set to turn on or off eye detection really quickly so I don't have to go into the menus. And I have my AF on button set to start the metering so that if I'm in servo mode, I can just hold this AF button down It maintains servo mode, so I can move around, the subject can move around. It's always locking onto the eye. And then while that's held down, I can press my shutter release and take that photo. So I can do both at the same time, maintain servo and take my shot. That's pretty much it for my menu settings. When I'm walking around shooting, I'm usually in AV mode on my camera because I'm constantly changing scenarios, different lighting, different people. I don't want to be doing a whole lot of fiddling with my camera. I want it to figure out the correct ISO and shutter speed, and I usually just stick with a aperture of f2 to keep it nice and shallow, have creative images that a lot of these guys shooting at f2.8 with all of their Trinity lenses can't really do. Be able to shoot if it gets a little bit darker all of a sudden, you know, I'm in the shadows and the clouds. It can keep my ISO nice and low. Single shot, so I don't take a whole burst of images I don't need. I like evaluative metering to use as much of the scenery and the subject that I'm focused on as possible. But if I'm shooting into the light, into a backlit subject, then I will switch to like a spot metering mode. I'll turn off eye autofocus and I'll switch to a spot metering and just focus on what I want to get in focus. And that's pretty much it for that. If I want something more creative, I'll switch to manual so I have full control of every setting without any automation. The last thing I do is video mode. If I want specific video settings, I'll switch it over to this. And it offers some different settings that I won't talk about today, but those are pretty much the 3 modes I use and the settings I have for my camera. So hopefully you learned something today, guys, and thank you for listening.